Hello, and welcome to History Bites, a monthly video series produced by George Mason's Gunston Hall for people who want to learn about their rights and how those rights have changed from the American Revolution to today. We find experts, and then we ask those experts to make their research easily digestible in 30 minutes or less. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Steir, and today we're joined by Dr. Lesley Shipley, who will be discussing her research on painting and art as a form of protest, and in particular, the ways in which women, especially Black women, have used art to express political dissent. Lesley Shipley is an associate professor of art history at Randolph College, where she teaches courses in modern and contemporary art. Her primary research interests include art and activism in the 1960s and 70s, and issues of gender and race in contemporary art. She is co-editor with Dr. May-Yen Moriuchi of the Routledge Companion to Art and Activism in the 21st Century. And today is the final session in a three-part series on the history of protest and activism. So before I turn it over to Dr. Shipley, I wanted to place her area of expertise within the context of the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the larger history of individual rights in America. Because in Article 3 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, George Mason wrote that the government, quote, is or ought to be instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people, nation, or community. And he went on to say that when any government shall be found inadequate or contrary to these purposes, a majority of the community has the indubitable, inalienable, and indefensible right to reform, alter, or abolish it. So, as we've discussed in previous episodes of History Bites, protest has been an important way throughout American history that citizens have acted on this idea of reforming governments that are behaving in ways they disagree with. And in another connection, the Virginia Declaration of Rights also ensures freedom of the press, calling it the bulwark of liberty. And while fine arts and painting, the mediums we're going to talk about today, aren't the press as George Mason conceived it, that idea of his in later documents about rights, particularly the Bill of Rights, became the idea of freedom of speech more broadly in order to protect the ways that citizens communicate with one another, their opinions about the political system and their ideas about reformation and dissent. So in that context, I would like to now turn things over to Dr. Shipley and hear a little bit more about your work.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you all see my painting as protest, I'm hoping?
Absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Great. So I do want to thank Dr. Steir for having me here today. And I also want to thank the Education Department at Gunston Hall, Rebecca Hall, and Grace Duckworth for giving me this opportunity. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Southwest Virginia on the traditional lands of the Monacan people, who are its original inhabitants and stewards. I really do appreciate this opportunity to share my current research, which centers on the relationship between art and protest. And what I hope to accomplish in less than 30 minutes, hopefully 15 to 20 minutes, is the following. I'd like to share a little bit about my research interests and my approach as an art historian, introduce my current project, and share some of my preliminary questions and observations about the art that I have been looking at. So as Dr. Steir mentioned, at Randolph College, I teach courses in modern and contemporary art history and also in museum studies. But while my central research and teaching is in art history, I also have a graduate degree in painting. And my experience with art making has shaped how I think about the relationship between art and history, and particularly how materials and processes of making affect how a work of art comes to have meanings or meanings, multiple meanings. So as an art historian, my primary source for understanding history and human experience is a visual and material object. And so careful, slow looking into how line, shape, color, composition, material, how all of these things work within an image is a big part of my methodology. In terms of research, I mostly focus on art of the United States since 1945, as Dr. Steir mentioned, with emphasis on intersections of gender, race, and art and activism, and also the histories of feminisms in art. But my current research over the past year or two has centered on these three artists that I have in front of you right now, and looking at how the language of painting has been used as a form of protest. And I'll come back to these three in a moment. So when you think of protest art, probably what comes to mind are posters held up at rallies, maybe like some of the ones that you saw this past weekend, or graffiti on public buildings or monuments. So on the right, I'm showing you the Robert E. Lee statue that used to be in Richmond, just up the road from me, and the fantastic plinth that unfortunately is no longer there either. But it really became kind of a public work of art, protest art. You might also think of public performances or actions like the climate activists who glued themselves to famous works of art or threw soup at Vincent van Gogh's sunflowers. And in the climate activist case, the paintings function as the target or site of the protest. But at least in the case of Van Gogh's sunflowers, the painting itself was not created as an expression of protest. But we don't have to go back too far to find examples of painting as a form of activism. And what I'm showing you now is probably one of the most famous examples of protest painting, Pablo Picasso's Guernica from 1937, which is now in Madrid. Picasso created this work in response to a real event that took place in April of 1937, the devastating aerial bombing of the northern Spanish town of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War. And at the time of the bombing, Picasso was in Paris, developing an idea for a mural commission that he had received from the Spanish Republican government. And after reading the news and seeing photographs of the tragedy in Guernica, he found his subject through his own emotional response to the horror of war. And he went on to create what would become one of the most famous anti-war works of art. And in the summer of 1937, Guernica was exhibited publicly at the Paris International Exposition. I don't have time to delve into the iconography or visual elements of this painting, but I do want to point out that I'll come back. He didn't illustrate the bombing at Guernica in this painting, but he used symbolism, color, and a modernist approach to form to capture the trauma and brutality of war. And my understanding also is that Picasso never used the term protest to describe his intentions for Guernica, and in fact really avoided any kind of explanation or interpretation of it, as many artists do. They want their work to speak for itself. But many of his viewers understood the implications of his work, and it has gone on to appear in protest movements from anti-war demonstrations during the American War in Vietnam to the present day. And on the left, I'm showing you an artist-led demonstration that took place actually in front of Guernica. Picasso had loaned it to the Museum of Modern Art in New York following World War II, and it had stayed in New York until 1981 when it returned to Spain. And this is a demonstration, an anti-war, American War in Vietnam demonstration by artists. And on the right is a poster with a fragment, incorporates a figure from Picasso's Guernica by a white New York artist, Rudolph Beranek. Now, Beranek brings me to this artist, May Stevens, whose work actually sparked my own kind of foray into this topic of painting as a form of protest. I had known about Stevens's iconic series, Big Daddy, through my research on the history of art and activism, but I hadn't delved into it until I was doing research on examples of protest art at my institution's museum, which is the Mayer Museum of Art at Randolph College, which has one of Stevens's prints, the one on the right, called Big Daddy Paper Doll from 1970. Like Picasso, Stevens was inspired by contemporary events, namely the American War in Vietnam, to create Big Daddy, but she also had her father in mind and Theodore Roosevelt as sources for this caricature of patriarchal authority. Big Daddy is a nude, fleshy, white middle-aged man with an absurdly phallic or bullet-shaped head and a bulldog in his lap. Her most famous depictions are like the one on the right, showing him as a paper doll, surrounded by uniforms for the military, police, a butcher, an executioner. Stevens's critique of authoritarianism in the guise of a middle-aged white man was not just about patriarchy or even just an anti-war statement, but it also exposes what James Baldwin called the lie of whiteness. The idea of Stevens's series as a direct critique of whiteness still needs to be fleshed out, I think, in the literature, and I hope to fill that gap with some of my research. As I was doing more research into Stevens and this idea of whiteness in painting, I came across this fantastic artist, Vivian Brown, who is a Black American artist and close friend of Stevens's became friends with Stevens in the early 70s. And I discovered this series by her called Little Men. Brown began the series while she was living in New York in the mid 1960s, around the same time that Stevens was working on her Big Daddy series, although they hadn't yet met as artists. The series, Brown's series, Little Men, consists of over 200 works on paper and paintings on canvas, all centered on one or more male figures in various absurd actions with grotesque faces and bodies, painted in a loose, expressionistic style. In an interview from 1968, Brown described how, after a brief period in which she found she could no longer paint, she began to explore more personal content that could speak to her experience of being a Black woman in a patriarchal society. Brown made this work out of her frustration and rage over her experiences of racism and sexism in both her personal and professional life. At the time, she was working for the New York Department of Education and painting when she could in the evenings and on weekends. Her encounters with male colleagues in the workplace, as well as memories of her father, became fodder for her painterly experimentation at this time. And she discovered that working through this personal material enabled her to achieve a more universal statement, which she called my kind of protest. And I'm just going to put a tiny plug in for this retrospective of Vivian Brown's work that's opening at the end of this month at the Phillips Collection, curated by Amara Antia and Adrian L. Childs. Brown exhibited her Little Men in the 1970s, but she often found the response by many, mostly male viewers, to be rather dismissive. In an interview, she says, during the civil rights era, one had to paint Black themes, Black people, Black ideas. I didn't. I was painting my kind of protest, but it didn't look like Black art. One of the questions we always had when I was teaching then was whether or not there is a Black art. Now they're saying, is there a woman's art? Then I was painting these little old white men. So reading this interview with Brown reminded me of another New York-based artist who had encountered similar criticism. Faith Ringgold, a Black American artist who also working in New York at the same time as Brown and Stevens. This particular series that she called American People was inspired by her personal experiences as a Black woman living in America, living and working as an artist and activist. And in her memoir, Ringgold recalls how some Black artists criticized her choice to paint white people. And I have the quote here. I'll just let you all look at it for a moment. I'll move forward. As activists and artists, Ringgold and Brown were leaders in these movements for social change, agitating for change in the art world, as well as, in society more broadly. And I'm showing you two photographs. On the left is Vivian Brown, and on the right is Faith Ringgold and her daughter, Michelle Wallace. They're at the same protest at the Whitney Museum. And they're calling for the museum to have 50% of the artists selected for the annual exhibition to be women. Just the year prior, the Whitney's annual only included 8 women out of a total of 151 artists. Brown and Ringgold weren't just participants, though. They were leaders of many of these organizations that plan protests and activist exhibitions. Brown, for example, was a co-founder of the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, an activist artist collective advocating for equal representation of Black artists in museums. And Brown was also a member of an all-women's collective, Where We At, Black Women Artists, that was founded by Ringgold and others. So as I discovered these connections among these 3 artists, 2 African American and 1 white, I started to wonder about how and why these artists came to painting as their medium for protest, and how white masculinity became their target. So right now, I'm looking at the 3 largest paintings in each of the artist series, which I'm showing you here. Faith Ringgold's Die from 1967, Vivian Brown's 7 Deadly Sins from 1968, and Mae Stevens's Big Daddy Paper Doll from 1970. And I would argue that they're remarkable protest paintings that stand out in this period for their direct critique of whiteness from a feminist perspective. Even if Brown, Ringgold, and Stevens were not consciously making work in response to each other's, they were all creating work that, to varying degrees, spoke out against whiteness and anti-Black violence by making it visible, and through their representations, exposing the underlying mythologies and pathologies of white supremacy. So I did want to spend just a couple of minutes looking at, or a minute, looking at Vivian Brown's work, since she is the least well-known of the 3, although there is this wonderful retrospective at the moment. 7 Deadly Sins on the right is not the first work, but it is the largest. And in it, we see 8 male figures of various sizes whose actions range from staring vacuously out of the painting, like this guy here, yelling, drinking, trying to eat their feet or do something with their feet. Their skin is modeled in shades of yellow, purple, blue, pink. A recent critic described them as expressionistic portraits of middle-aged white men, but I think that the features, the exaggeration and distortion, along with the absurd poses, suggest that they're really more caricatures. So with this series, Brown communicates not only anger at a certain kind of masculine authority figure, but she also highlights the negative effects that racism and sexism have on the perpetrators themselves. These figures are repulsive, they're pathetic. Brown isn't simply representing whiteness, but creating visual interrogations and deconstructions of whiteness as privilege and power. And her style is quite different from Faith Ringgold, who uses, and Stevens as well, who use flat areas of color, fragmented forms. So as I delved into the shared historical context of these 3 artists, I've become curious about the implications of their identities and their shared focus on whiteness and white masculinity. The second wave feminist movement, as many of us know, was really dominated by middle-class white women. And many of the concerns and issues voiced by women of color, like Faith Ringgold and Vivian Brown, were dismissed or ignored. And Stevens, the white artist of the group, acknowledged her complicity as a white woman with the content of her Big Daddy series. She said that in the Big Daddies, there's a sense of complicity, that I'm a part of that. He's a family member, And I don't mean that specifically, although it's another element. So I think she was trying to juggle the symbolic nature of Big Daddy with this personal history that she had with the idea. She says, I'm white and I'm part of that lower middle class and I'm paying those taxes. I'm part of that country. So there's a very painful kind of ambiguity. Here, she acknowledges her relationship to whiteness as a racial construct and how her own awareness of her experience of race possibly informed her work. So, my working hypothesis right now is that all three artists understood that the path to liberation was impossible if people could not visualize or name whiteness and its dehumanizing effects. Their activism and their art practice were intertwined, and we can see this in their work from this period. Paintings that challenged social and cultural norms, disrupted hierarchies, and exposed the weaknesses of a patriarchal society. They believed in the people's right to protest and in their art's capacity to contribute to public discourse. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That has inspired so many thoughts and questions in me.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to first start off with the period in which these artists were writing, or not writing. This is, you can tell I'm the historian. I'm so sorry. Painting.
Paintings are a text.
Yes, absolutely. So we had another speaker talking about the 1960s and the way that student protest could explode at that moment because in part of mass communications, visual media, and the ability for students who were protesting in different countries to share information and to share aesthetics. And I'm wondering if that is part of why there is this explosion of protest art seemingly in this moment, or if it's tied to other things like the civil rights movement, like modernism, or if in fact I'm actually just looking at a very tiny sample size and these women were really focused on this issue.
Well, I mean, the 60s are just such a fascinating decade. The long 60s, the end of the 50s into the 70s, it's such a fascinating time in the art world and also in a large sense. Because really in the 60s, what a lot of artists are doing are working abstractly. They're working with, sculpture and works of performance and things like that. So these artists, Ringgold and Stevens and Brown, in some ways are working in a more traditional medium in oil painting. They certainly were, looking to other forms of media. They were, listening. They talk about listening to the radio in their studios, watching things on television, reading newspapers. Mae Stevens actually did some paintings and drawings based on newspaper photographs that she found. I think for these three artists, it really was the civil rights, the anti-war, and the growing feminist, women's liberation movement that really propelled them. I don't know if that answers your question, but I know that for instance, I left this out of the presentation, but I can go back and show it to you. I've been really curious about this particular moment in history at this time, what was called the long hot summer of 1967, when there were hundreds of uprisings in specifically Black urban communities who were frustrated by police violence against unarmed Black men. And this particular summer was when Faith Ringgold, all three of them really were working on these series, and they were, but Faith Ringgold specifically talks about this event. And what strikes me also as coming out of this is this report, the Kerner Commission report. And in it, it specifically identifies white racism as responsible for what's happening in these communities. It's a really an important document that if people don't know about it, I recommend looking at it. But it was really interesting to me that they called out white racism um, at this particular moment. And so I wonder, I'm sure that, these artists are reading that when it came out in 68. Um, so
Absolutely. Thank you. That was really, really helpful. Because I spend most of my time thinking about the 18th century.
yeah.
Which also in terms of your kind of conclusion section and your thoughts about whiteness as a category was very interesting to me.
Yeah.
Because in the 18th century, you know, particularly in Virginia at the colonial level, even before the American Revolution, there are a series of laws in which the House of Burgesses continuously has to define, first of all, who is eligible for enslavement and make the choice to make that race based, as opposed to religiously based, as opposed to about, you know, place of birth. There were a lot of different options that were floating around at the time. And the House of Burgesses over time created this kind of legal legislation to tie it to race. And they also then created a sort of legal category of race that not only impacted enslaved people, but free people of color as well. For example, laws in the 18th century saying that free people of color could only enslave people who were the same color as they were or darker. And so I wonder if this history of a legal framework that first needed to define enslavement, and then because of the way it defined enslavement, needed to define Blackness, created perhaps a legacy in which the legal definition of what James Baldwin, for example, might by the 60s refer to as minority groups, a little bit more clear and articulated than majority groups. And I know that this is something that he wrote about, for example, is
Yeah.
there is no definition of the majority. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering if you have any like preliminary thoughts on perhaps the way that the long American history, legal history there might be in some hidden ways impacting the world that these women inherit. I'm not sure.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I appreciate that question because I am trying to do a lot more reading on the history of whiteness. So Nell Painter's book, The History of White People, is fantastic. And I am trying to think about how that construct, I mean, it is a fluid thing. It's a thing that shifts. But I don't know as much about, and I really should look into this in the 60s, what in the census, what were some of the categories, how were things identified? I know I've seen friends of mine who have birth certificates that have particular language identifying them if they're African American, not using African American, but using a different word that we no longer use, so
Yeah.
the language is an issue there too. Um, yeah. I think that, yeah, it's an area that I teach a course on African American art. I thought, I really actually don't think about whiteness as a race. And so that also kind of propelled me to look at these works and think about them differently. Um, and so, yeah, I think that looking at how Blackness was defined, but also how whiteness had to be, defined in relation to, is a really important history.
Yeah. And one of the interesting pieces from the 18th century perspective and from the George Mason perspective
Mhm.
is that in the original draft of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, at the beginning of it, he wrote that all men are by nature equal. And the rest of the committee, the only change that they added, and you can see this in the original document at the Library of Virginia, was to like insert the language all men who enter into a state of society. And that's kind of interesting, ambiguous language
So
that,
weird. It's very weird
yeah.
language.
So perhaps that's also maybe a way of thinking about how some of these categories were intentionally defined or not defined in the
Right.
founding era. I don't know. But we are running up on time. This is so rich. I just want to keep talking to you
Thank
all
you.
day.
Thank you so
Um, Yeah, well, thank you for joining us. And also for people who are inspired by what you had to say, do you have other work coming out? Are there other projects that people can find online or on other media?
Well, I am giving a paper in September, at the end of September, at American University at their Feminist Art History Conference. So I'm hoping to have even more kind of gelled thoughts about this work there. And then I hope, to pursue it further. But that's my next kind of project.
Absolutely. Well, everyone who's watching, mark your calendars. And thank you for joining us for History Bites. So we'll see you back here with another Feast for Your Brain, third Wednesday of next month. That will be July 16th. And we will be joined by Dr. Kevin McQueenie, who will be discussing the history of maternal mortality and inequality in access to healthcare and how that has impacted people's ideas about the right to safety over time. So in the meantime, please comment, subscribe, keep the conversation going. It really helps our channel. And as always, stay hungry.
Hello. Okay.